Hi, everyone. Ed Bixby here from the Global Green Burial Alliance, and this is Spotlight Now. Today, I am with Ngaio Davis of KORU Cremation. Ngaio Davis is the founder and principal owner of KORU Cremation Burial Ceremony in Vancouver, Canada. A death care practitioner at heart, Ngaio is inspired by her rich Maori heritage and her maternal grandmom and grandmother's and great grandma's end of life rituals. Sorry, that's a tongue twister there. Nadia has never been conventional. From being raised on a small farm in rural British Columbia to becoming a Red Seal carpenter and working in construction to choosing to work in death care services. After a number of years working for conventional corporate funeral businesses, Ngaio was eventually called to create her own practice where she relishes the freedom to spearhead meaningful and courageous conversations through her unconventional micro death care practice of KORU. So welcome, Ngaio.
Thanks so much, Ed.
Great to have you here and be able to talk a little bit about the good work that you do. So for our providers and for our consumers, why don't we get started by learning a little bit more about your background and what led to the creation of KORU. I understand that you were largely influenced by your family heritage.
Yeah, with the creation of the practice that I do now, absolutely. And this is probably a fairly familiar story with licensed funeral directors and embalmers who cut their teeth in the conventional world because, that's where the education is and that's where it starts for many of us. Working for them for many years. And don't get me wrong, I learned a lot of valuable lessons, information, and got a lot of good background. But I really did come to the point working for conventional funeral services where I just felt completely alienated for the reasons that drew me into it in the first place, that it was this heart-centered work. You could really meet with families where they're at and provide the services that they were looking for with guidance. And it just felt like things were going, for me, sideways. The focus became different. And so I got to a point where I thought I'm either going to have to get right out of death care and find another career, or crazy idea, why don't I open up my own practice? And so it started from there. And the influence from my own family heritage, I think, was just there as that backdrop of support to say, yeah, we did used to do things differently in Canada. And on the Maori side of my heritage, on my dad's side, they currently do things in a way that to me is just very, it just meets the needs of what happens when somebody dies. It meets the needs of our early grief and it helps us on that grief journey. And it's very community oriented. So I wanted to be able to have a practice that was more community oriented. And I really wanted to be able to be flexible and adaptive to what it was that people were wanting, instead of saying, here are our packages, if you will, and you must fit into these packages kind of thing. So that was just, to me, it was kind of a simple idea to begin with. And the more I started exploring that, I realized there was this whole other world out there. So this was like 10 plus years ago, 11 years ago, that I didn't know existed in death care, which was people wanting to be able to understand how home death practices worked. Can we do things without having to hire a funeral professional? And death doulas were just slowly starting to come on the scene. And so that really piqued my interest, given that I was looking for a different way to be with people, with the survivors of people after they died, and how to care for the dead. And so I started exploring those kinds of options and realized that, hey, this really fits with my heritage on both sides of my family.
And it's a familiar story, and you probably know this, that, sometimes when people aren't born into this profession, it goes very differently for them because they're expecting or they're wanting something more or different out of it. So I can appreciate the fact that you were searching for your niche, your place within this industry, and you found it. And and it sounds like your Maori, your Maori heritage, had a lot to do with that, bringing you back to maybe a simpler time, traditions, the way your family would treat their loved ones in the past. And I think we all can relate to that. We all, funeral service in the 20th century is very different than it was previous to that. So I think we're getting back to basics. So it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. And if you could tell us a little bit about your services and what makes them different from a traditional funeral home. I understand that KORU specializes in green death care. So what does that look like?
Yeah. So, it really, for me, I think it just really comes down to mindset. How am I going to approach working with clients? And my environmental impact has always been important in my personal life. And I'm not from a family of staunch environmentalists, but I am from a family of farmers, and farmers care about their impact on the world. They want it to be healthy so that the food we put in our bodies is healthy and the environment around us is clean. And so it's from those kind of humble roots that I look at how do I impact the environment, and then what can I do in my own personal practices to be mindful of that. And so I wanted to be able to carry that on in the business part of my life as well. It doesn't make sense to only be at home and trying to be mindful of how I impact the environment, and then go to work and have embalming chemicals and not be looking at where do our products come from that I offer to our clients. So the green practices for me are not just the green disposition offerings like green burial. We don't have the option to offer natural organic reduction or terramation in British Columbia yet, and nor are we able to offer aquamation, but I advocate very publicly about that, around those two things. And I talk to people about it. I help them understand what it is and what the benefits of it are. So yeah, my green practices are all about how do my daily business practices go, along with how does that translate into caring for our dead and the survivors of the people who have died. So, like just I mentioned products. I try really hard with our caskets and shrouds that they're either made in Canada, that's where we're located, and as local as possible. And if they're not made in Canada, that they're made out of a sustainable material and they're recognized by Green Burial Council as a great standard to go by, recognized by them as being something that is sustainable. So that's one thing that I've done. I have a lot of biodegradable urns, and I know when I worked for the conventional funeral services, some of those companies had cemeteries, and you never talked about biodegradable urns because you had to be selling something that would be permanent to go in their cemetery. So just even that idea of switching away from typical memorialization and helping people understand if you want to do something different, there are greener options for that. And then body care of the deceased, I think, is a huge area in funeral services where we can really minimize our impact. Embalming is part of my trade. I used to do it all the time. I used to be a provincial adjudicator for our up and coming students. So it is a trade that I do see a lot of value in, and I choose to not offer it as part of our services that we do on site. If families are requesting for their person to be embalmed, then we take them to a morgue where that can happen, but it doesn't happen on our site. So we're reducing our site within our own practice. And I have to say, I love going into our bathing room and not just having that lingering chemical smell. I love not being exposed to it when I'm, bathing and cleaning our deceased. And I've learned so much about decedent care by deliberately focusing on just natural body care.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And during my tenure at the Green Burial Council, it was my feeling was that the safety of the embalmer was really the real issue when it comes to embalming fluid itself. So I'm glad to hear that you recognize that you don't, appreciate being around that anymore, and it's much better for you not to be. And I did a lot of work and have done a lot of work, in the great country of Canada. You guys have really made great strides, and it's wonderful, having you not only as neighbors, but to know that we have comrades in arms, basically, with the same mission. You talked a little bit about the availability of the disposition options in British Columbia, and obviously we know there's some legal limitations, and I'm sure you've navigated it in a way that, the best that you could. But with that being said, to get to like the legislation side, what is the current status on aquamation and natural organic reduction concerning their possible legalization in British Columbia? And have there been efforts initiated to bring these options to your province? I mean, has that started yet?
Yes, yeah. So I'm part of two groups that are actively advocating for both aquamation and for natural organic reduction. And the aquamation group has been going longer than the natural organic reduction one. Obviously, it's been around longer. And it started from industry insiders who were trying to get the attention of the government. And that went on for years, with the government really just saying, whatever, that sounds very self-serving. At least, that's my take on it. But in the last, probably 6 years, it's been a group of non-industry people. They're mostly retired women. They have environmental interests, they have community interests, and they have been writing letters like crazy. They have been activating other communities. And I really think through their efforts, we've got to the point today where our provincial government is saying, okay, we get it. The public is actually looking for other options. They want choice, and we know we need to change our legislation. So we haven't got the legislation change yet, but our provincial funeral association feels really confident that this is going to happen sooner or later. So time frame, I don't know. I would love it if it happened, within the next year to 2 years, and maybe that will. So that's what's going on that front. And so because of the efforts of the aquamation group, our natural organic reduction group that's only been going for about a year and a half, it seems to be riding this tide, riding the wave that the aquamation group started. And we're able to piggyback on their successes. And so the government is understanding that they don't need to just change the legislation to allow aquamation, but natural organic reduction as well. And my hope is that they will word the legislation so that it can allow for the future, whatever comes. 10 years ago, nobody knew that natural organic reduction would be on the books. So I would like it to be that we don't have to wait 50 years every time for the government to change the books, and they can just word it so that there's flexibility there. So I think we're finally on a downward slope with that advocacy, and change is coming. So that's super positive.
No, absolutely. And the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So, with the advocacy and with the people who have been expressing their needs and wants, it sounds to me like you are, moving in the right direction. And, it really is about serving people with greener options, and it just makes sense. So I think you have a bright future. I'm sure they will pass it, and hopefully they do pass it sooner than later. And you know, I've spent some time in Canada, and it's a beautiful country, and it is wild and it's scenic. And to me, just the whole essence of natural burial and the sustainability side makes so much sense for a Canadian person and the way they live their life. And what would you say draws your customers to the eco-friendly services and green death care in general? Have you observed an increased interest, since you've opened?
Yeah, more so lately, I would say. So when I first opened, realized that there are all these other opportunities out there in death care that they didn't teach us in the conventional funeral world. I was all gung ho, and I would do, you know, a handful of green burials in a year. And just last week we did two of them, not, well, two of them, I think. The other one wasn't a green burial. So it comes in spurts, but it is gaining traction. More and more people are just inquiring about it, which is excellent. There's confusion though. Some people equate green burial with somebody's been cremated and then I want a green burial for the cremated remains. So just having to make sure that the education is there to talk about that green burial for cremated remains, but then just green burial and what we're actually referring to. And I found lately people, I'm not sure what the change has been, or, you know, maybe it's just enough people have started talking about it. And so as that word spreads, then, you know, obviously, and then more people are going to come forward. We don't have a ton of option when it comes to green burial cemeteries where I'm located in the Vancouver area. But there's one cemetery in particular that opened probably about 7 or so years ago, Heritage Garden Cemetery, and their whole cemetery is a sustainable cemetery. They have just been fantastic. So I know that they've been able to generate a lot of education and excitement for people to realize that in an urban area, we can go to this beautiful, sustainable cemetery where they've got memorial honeybee hives and they've got all kinds of really cool things going out there. So.
Well, and you know, you made a very good point with saying that, you know, because really natural burial knows no boundaries. So it's wonderful to have it not only in our forests and our preserves, but also within our inner cities, because it is a true representation of who we are and a celebration of a life that was lived and a beautiful place to visit. You know, so I'm really glad to hear that, you know, you've got that option available to you. You know, certainly any of the viewers listening to this, if you're, you know, within Ngaio's province, you know, reach out and connect. You know, maybe there's some other options out there that people aren't aware of. You know, because the hybrid model really is the low hanging fruit. You know, where we can you can offer this in any cemetery as long as the cemetery is willing to provide it.
That's right.
And with that being said, brings me to the, you know, my favorite part of the spotlight is to know, you know, where would you hope to see KORU and eco-friendly funeral movement in British Columbia, say, in the next 5 to 10 years? What would, you know, how would you like things to turn out?
Yeah. I would love that aquamation and natural organic reduction are legal offerings, and that I am able to be a provider of both of those things. And if not both of them, then know that I've got a partner who's offering one and I'm able to offer another. I would love to be able to see expansion of our way of offering death care practices throughout our province and not just be so local in the urban area. And you know, and that when people come in, they're not surprised by the offerings, the disposition offerings. You know, they're not just asking for cremation and burial, and meaning conventional burial, that they already know that there's natural organic reduction as an option, or aquamation, and they're ready to have a discussion about which green form of disposition is really going to match their values and make sense for them. I think that would be incredible if we got to that point in 5 to 10 years.
You know, Ngaio, I think we will. I think, you know, the good news is that your vision will come true, and it's a beautiful one, and it will most certainly be, there will be a day where I think eco-friendly funeral options are the premier or the top option to choose from. Because ultimately, you know, no matter what type of lifestyle that you lead or where you live, we all are, you know, tied to the earth that we live in. And
Yeah.
it makes sense. You know, it makes perfect sense. So, you know, thanks for joining us today, Ngaio. Our viewers can learn more by visiting KORUCremation.com. Certainly support the efforts of Ngaio and people like Ngaio within our network and outside. Encourage them to get involved. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ed. And thanks so much for what you do. It's so important to be able to connect us all together, whether you're a practitioner or, just somebody in the community wanting to understand what's going on out there. So thanks.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. So, all right, everyone, see you at the next spotlight. Thank you.